Okay.
All right, so today in the driver's seat, we have feminist and author and Senate candidate for the Reason Party, Jane Caro. How you doing, Jane?
I'm doing very well. I'm quite excited about this and slightly nervous.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for coming for a drive today. I'm very excited about it as well. I've been really looking forward to this drive because I've been following you on Twitter for a couple of years.
Thanks. Oh, well, you know what you're in for then.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we're going to have a great chat. We're going to talk about your career, and we're going to talk about climate change, and also this incredible clean technology that we're sitting in at the moment, and the opportunities that Australia has with the transition.
Yes. We should be doing it. We should have started ages ago.
Yep, absolutely. The best time to start was 20 years ago, but the next best time is now. So, all right. So you're all set. All we need to do, last thing I need to show you is you put your foot on the brake.
Yep.
And this paddle, if you push that down, hard down, that's put you in drive. So you can see that drive, reverse. I'll just show you reverse as well. So hard up. That puts you into reverse, and then the reverse camera comes on.
Got it.
And then hard down.
You have to realise I'm so out of practice with new cars, having an old one. I don't even have a reversing camera in my current car, so I still do that.
Yeah. We're such creatures of habit.
Yep.
But yeah, I think you're all set now. So all you need to do now is push the accelerator, and it'll start moving.
Oh my goodness! It sounds like it does too. You weren't lying.
Yeah.
Which way should we go?
I think we go left.
Okay. This is so nice and easy to drive.
Yeah.
Like I feel really comfortable in it straight away. Like it's not strange.
It's very intuitive, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's I can feel like it's quite powerful.
We can actually do a little 0 to 100 here if you like.
Okay, let's give it a go.
So when you're ready, you can plant it to the floor and do a 0 to 100.
Okay.
All the way. Hang on to it.
Hang on to go.
Okay, let go. How's that?
Much faster than I would normally go. I'm quite conservative.
But it felt quite safe still?
Yeah, it did. No, it felt fine. I felt in control. It wasn't, outrageous, and it was kind of fun.
Yeah. Normally in an internal combustion engine, that would feel pretty scary to go that quick.
Well, there's a noise that accompanies that sort of acceleration, and that increases, I think, the stress of it.
Yeah.
And because there's a noise, it's silent, and you just feel this ramping up. Yeah, it's sort of, this is cool.
Yeah. And you'll also feel, as we go around the corner, it stays very flat and holds the road.
Yes, and you see me, I'm leaning because I'm used to the old way of doing things. Also, of course, the last time I think I drove around these bends was on my now husband, then boyfriend's very large motorbike. So I was leaning right over.
Wow. So this is a pretty special area for you up here.
Yeah, I grew up around here. I grew up in Terry Hills. Went to Forest High. With Greg Mullins. And so yeah, this area, these roads, very familiar to me. It feels quite nostalgic and quite interesting to be in my old stamping ground when I was a teenager as a grandmother in this very new technology. It feels like the past and the future coming together.
Yeah, and it's these vehicles are quite incredible because it's like a step change. It's a real step change, and it's not just the fact that it's electric, it's all the other kind of bits that come with it.
Yeah. And getting used to the fact that when you take your foot off the accelerator, it's quite a strong slow.
Yeah.
Like if you do that in a conventional car, often the speed doesn't really change very much at all.
Yep. Now there's so many things I want to chat to you about today, and we had a really good conversation on the way up here, and I hope we revisit some of those things.
Sure.
But first off, you mentioned the noise of the cars before. Now, we know that a lot of cars, they're actually made to be really loud with their exhaust, right?
Yeah.
And we know also that it's generally blokes who are buying those kind of
young blokes
loud.
To, I don't know, mark their territory for some reason.
Yeah, and I've always found it quite fascinating because I hate noise. I really hate noise, and especially in the city, this constant background noise or the noise of internal combustion engine. It's really stressful. And I recently heard this term called petromasculinity. And I thought you'd be like the perfect person to talk to about that today.
Oh yeah, I mean, let's go back to my husband's misspent youth on Honda 750 motorbikes with the baffles pulled out, which meant making as much more noise as humanly possible and howling around roads like this. Really getting the pegs, which is where you put your feet, as low to the ground, and the aim was to get sparks fly. And I wore the heels of some of my then 70s platform boots on one side from putting my foot. I mean, I was a rev head in those days, but only on the back seat, on the ground as we were going around corners.
You
really
wore you wore like the edge off them.
Yeah, I wore the edge off them. I know. If only my parents had known.
Yeah.
So yes, and that was a form of petromasculinity. It was a sort of proving of courage and skill. And I think that's what big engined cars and bikes certainly did for the boys of my generation. They used them to prove their courage and skill. Of course, it killed some of them. I've lost school friends and people I knew in the 70s, particularly in motorcycle accidents. And my husband now suffers from arthritis quite badly, mostly as the result of coming off motorbikes way too many times. So a petromasculinity, I mean, I quite enjoyed it as a young girl, and not all the guys who were into fast cars were what we used to call then male chauvinist pigs. Certainly my husband wasn't. But there was something tied up with the idea of themselves as dominant, as making a mark. I mean, the noise those machines made people stop what they were doing, turn and look, or be irritated. And there was something about that was a kind of almost like graffiti on a rock. I was here.
Yeah. And you hear even with like these cars that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, like Lamborghinis or Ferraris, they make such loud noises. It's kind of like a statement, like I'm here, look at me, kind of thing. It's almost like the roar of a lion or something like. Where does this come from, and why do we? Is it baked into us to like that, or I don't know.
The nature nurture argument.
Yeah.
Always endless. No one can ever come to a resolution. Look, I am sure. I mean, I used to enjoy being on the back of that motorbike, and I enjoyed when people turned to look at us, and I took pleasure in the fact that I was the brave girlfriend on the back. Of course, I had a good way of being brave because I was too short to see what was happening in front. So that made me, I didn't know what was going on, so I didn't care. Like a horse with blinkers, I suppose. But I think, I'm not sure that it's gender related. I think it may be baked into humanity.
Yeah. That
we need to make our mark somehow.
Yeah.
And that was one way that a lot of guys, and they got permission to do it. There was still in those days the idea that the man should drive. If you went out on a date, it was always the boy in the driver's seat, even if it was your car. And on the way back, they're often pissed. I don't know how I survived my youth, frankly. So yeah, I think it was cars were associated with men.
Yeah.
And they were associated with men because they were about being in control. And women were the passenger. They were being, in a way, like the car, controlled, driven around rather than driving themselves around. I mean, it's really interesting to me that Saudi Arabia, for example, it took them until very, very recently to allow women to drive. This clearly indicates, and this is a very patriarchal culture, very misogynistic, that there's something heavily symbolic about driving and freedom and control. And so, yes, when I was young, that was very much the way. Interestingly enough, I think random breath testing changed that quite a lot, because suddenly the two markers of masculinity, which was I get pissed and I drive my car, couldn't mix. And so what happened was they gave up the I get to drive my car so that they could continue to get pissed
Right.
and make their wife the designated driver.
Wow.
We win.
Yeah,
Never.
wow.
In the patriarchal bargain. And so, yeah, I think it's about control. But getting pissed, of course, is the loss of control. Driving a car is the holding on to the being the one in control.
Yeah,
it's interesting how they're actually opposites.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and the noise thing, it fascinates me. And as you know, I started this series up in central Queensland and taking coal miners and other people up there for drives, and it's a very masculine culture up there.
Yeah.
I grew up there, and but one of the fascinating things was that we'd take these guys out. A lot of them, we'd grown up with, and some of the guys had rebuilt V8s and been into that masculine, like that car culture.
Petrol
right?
heads,
Petrol
as we
heads.
called them, yeah.
And a lot of those guys commented on how nice it was to have the quiet car in the Tesla. So it's almost like that. It's possible that culture could be replaced. It's not it's not a necessary thing.
Well, they can get over it. They do it already. They just do the doof doof really, really, really loud. Like you see so many young men, usually almost always young men, driving around, and you can hear the car coming, not because of the engine of the car, but because
Metallica.
of the volume of the...
Yeah, well, this car does have a great stereo, so maybe that's going to help replace that.
That's right. There's only one question I've got about the noise, and this is because I am the opposite of a young male petrol head. I'm a grandmother. Is I thought it worries me slightly with children not being in the car, but being pedestrians and things if they can't hear the car coming, and also I worry about people with vision impairment or anything like that and not being able to hear the car coming. Is that dangerous? Do we need to put a little bit of noise in there so that...
I don't think so. I follow electric vehicles really closely, and I've never seen a single report of an accident from someone who didn't
hear the
car.
Okay.
And we drive with vision, and we cross the road with vision, and we do have vision impaired people, but
they usually guide dogs or some sort of aid that helps them to know what's moving through space, which isn't just their ears.
I wanted to learn more about your upbringing and your career and what led you to get into feminism, and then ultimately what has led you to put your hand up and run for the Senate with the Reason Party.
Well, I grew up around here. I was born in the UK in London, and my parents migrated here when I was nearly 6, and we lived in French's Forest, which isn't far from Terry Hills. And then my parents decided to build a house in Terry Hills, and so we moved down here. And I had a very unremarkable upbringing. My parents are very sensible, very intelligent people. My father was a very successful businessman. My mother was a thwarted person in many ways, super smart, but born in the generation of women who were never encouraged to develop their intelligence into some sort of career. She had 4 children, only planned to have 2, but had 2 of us were torn condoms, I believe, and me and my youngest sister. And she was not a happy housewife at all. She was always an intellectual. She was always an academic. She should have been a professor of history, I think. And had she been born 20 or 30 years after she was, she probably would have been. So that frustration, I think, of my mother's life, which she was really open and honest about, which I actually really, I'm grateful for, because she didn't say to her daughters, well, that's just a women's lot, this is what we have to do, this is what you've got to do, or pretend she enjoyed it. She was honest with us, and she said things like, don't do what I did. Do not do what I did. Go to university, get a job. Sure, if you fall in love, get married. And having kids is nice, but don't have too many of them. And she was very, very honest about the fact that she felt she'd made She was very happy in her marriage. My parents are still devoted to one another, both still alive, about to have their joint 90th birthday party on the 10th of April.
Yeah.
And both hale and hearty and all their marbles and everything else. But so she never regretted marrying my father, but she regretted the kind of life marriage and motherhood kind of trapped her in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I and my sisters saw that very clearly. I don't think it was as easy for my brother to cope with, but me and my sisters saw it clearly, and because of her honesty, I guess we made decisions about the kinds of lives we were going to have, and we were going to follow our mother's advice and not do what she'd done.
Mm-hmm.
And she was a feminist right from the beginning, so I imbibed feminism with my mother's milk. I didn't come to it. It was always part of my mother's view of the world, and she was very articulate and very good at communicating that view to us. And she, in fact, and my father were both politically active. They were politically active in the Save Our Government Schools activism back in the 60s and 70s. That my mother was very active as an early conservationist.
Mm-hmm.
She was part of the Stop the Duffy's Forest Airport Committee.
Mm.
They were successful, where the Small Plains Club wanted to put an airport on the edge of Ku-ring-gai Chase in Duffy's Forest.
Oh, just near here.
Near here. And my mother and some of the other, almost exclusively women in the area, took the green bans as an inspiration and fought really hard to preserve the bushland where some rare waratahs grew from being turned into a small airport. And so I watched my mother campaign successfully and win and save a part of this, lovely area.
Yeah.
And thank goodness she did. We resented it, as kids do. I was in high school at the time at Forest High up in French's Forest. Davidson hadn't been built by then, so from here we went to Forest High. And all of us went, bar a few. In fact, almost nobody went to private schools. We all went to Forest High. It was great. So we all knew each other. We had a community.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd resented my mother always answering the phone and, a living room full of posters and all that kind of thing. But I was also proud of her. So, and I guess that idea of being an activist, and if you want things to change and you think something's wrong,
Yep.
you've got to stand up
Yep.
and do something about it. You don't just sit there and be a passive recipient of bad decisions by people in power.
Mm-hmm.
And also the fact that they won, I suppose that encouraged me to believe that
It's possible.
it was possible.
Yeah.
And then, of course, both my parents were members, would you believe, of the Liberal Party.
Probably quite a different Liberal Party back then, was it?
Yeah, they would have been seen as among the wets, as they were then called. They particularly admired people like Ian McPhee and Chris Puplik, and there were a number of very good, forward-thinking, socially progressive people in the Liberal Party at that time. And my father stood for pre-selection as the state member for Ku-ring-gai and was beaten, I believe, by one vote, but maybe, someone will have to check that, and actually it's not true. It's a fond daughter's biased memory, I don't know, by Nick Greiner. But I know he was beaten by Nick Greiner, and Dad got down to the last two. And my mother stood for pre-selection for the Liberal Party for the Senate and was beaten by Bronwyn Bishop.
Oh, wow.
And I sometimes think, what a different world we might have had
Yeah.
if, in fact, they had won, because they've always been very socially progressive.
Yeah.
Economically conservative, but socially progressive, which I think is the dominant kind of mindset of most Australians. I think that's we're not economic radicals, I don't think, by any means, but we are prepared to live and let live. We're not really very interested in getting.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think we're seeing that reflected in the rise of the independence movement, because they're filling that vacuum that has been left by the Liberal Party, with its move to the conservative right, it's opened up this space for independence to fill.
Socially progressive, economically conservative. Independence to fill, absolutely, because unfortunately the current Liberal Party, as far as I can see, has become very captive to vested interests in terms of the fossil fuel industry in particular, but also to church interests. It's become much more religious than I remember it being, back in the day when my parents were involved. I mean, my parents are both atheists, and always have been. I was brought up in a completely non-religious family. My father's family were Jewish originally, we think, but they were very unusual in that there was absolutely no memory of religion. Like they weren't aware of being lapsed of anything. They weren't rejecting anything. Just had no interest. Didn't mean anything to them. My mother was brought up as a Methodist, and indeed her parents met in Sunday school in Manchester, but she became so virulently anti-Methodist or anti-religion in general, she could almost she could have been called not a lapsed, an anti. And saw it as very sexist and patriarchal, and to some extent, I think, the agent of a lot of her frustrations about the kind of life that she was able to aspire to, being born in 1931.
And do you think that Australia is becoming less religious?
Well, we know it is.
And we know it is. So therefore, like, Australia is becoming less religious, but the Liberal Party is becoming more religious.
Yep.
So that's really not going to end well for the Liberal Party, is it?
No, there's a big disconnect.
Yeah.
And sometimes, as I look at some of the policies that this government in particular has tried to enact, for example, the religious discrimination bill, I think to myself, are you trying to bring in some kind of theocracy? Australia already is arguably a bit of a soft theocracy, because the separation of church and state is not as clearly delineated here as it is, oddly enough, in the United States, which is a much more overtly religious country than Australia. But there's no way under their constitution and legal system that they could give public money to private schools. And no other country in the world does it the way we do. No other country.
We have a lot of religious schools in this country, don't we, as a percentage?
And they're all private, and they're all publicly subsidised. And they are publicly subsidised with the kind of extraordinary generosity that is literally unique to this country. And they have no reciprocal obligations. So, as I occasionally say, we have two education systems. One has all the rights. They have the right to set any fee they want. They have the right to service whatever community they feel like and not service other communities. And they have the right to decide which kids they will educate and which kids they won't educate. And then we have another system, publicly subsidised system, that has all the responsibilities. They're not allowed to charge fees. Well, they can charge voluntary fees, but they can't exclude a child from education because we have a compulsory education system. They can't choose what communities they'll service because as part of a universal compulsory education system, they have to have a school in every community. For every child has to be able to find a place. And then they also cannot choose which kids they will or won't educate. They have to take whatever kids in area turn up on the doorstep. So we have one system with all the rights and all the bloody money, and one system with all the responsibilities, and we starve that one. And we wonder why we have such wicked problems with the calibre of people at the top end of our society. Because frankly, if they got there on merit, they're doing a very good job of disguising it.
Yeah, now I went to a public school in central Queensland and I had great schooling, but we spoke about this earlier. The Australian Parliament is not equally represented between public school and private school. We have a high concentration of parliamentarians who are from private schools. Is that right?
Absolutely. I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but the politician, particularly in a leadership or important role in a cabinet or shadow cabinet that went to a public school, is a rare beast. I know Tanya Plibersek did. I know John Howard did, interestingly enough. And Scott Morrison did. But Scott Morrison went to a selective public school. I'm not a particular fan of selective schools. I don't like exclusion for any reason. I like inclusion. And I like all children to realise, I think it's the single most important lesson a child can realise, that they are not special, that they are not more important than any other child, that they are not better or superior to any other child for any reason, that all children are of equal value and equal worth. And that's what a universal public education system intrinsically teaches. Yes, there will be inequalities. Yes, you have rich areas of town and poorer areas of town. And yes, you will have, therefore, schools that service richer populations and poorer ones. But just because things will never be completely equal doesn't mean you say, oh, well, we won't even bother then. What we'll do is we'll take all our education funding and we'll use it to drive the inequalities as wide as we could possibly make them. That is not an argument. That is not an argument.
Yeah, it's just crazy. And like, if you go around Melbourne or Sydney and you look at some of these private schools and the amount of wealth and what they've got, and you compare that to some of the public schools, it's just mind-blowing how big the divide is, and it's wasted. And
it's wasted. It doesn't add to the kids' education.
Yeah.
It doesn't gain us any advantage in terms of educating students.
No.
In fact, it's the opposite.
Yeah, and I mean, if we look, you obviously know a lot about the education system, and I'm sure you know a bit about some of the world's best education systems. And let's talk about like Finland, right? Where it does have a much more egalitarian schooling system, and they have one of the best school education systems in the world. Is that right?
Correct. And they have no private schools. They have about 75 charter schools.
None at all.
No.
Wow.
And they certainly have no subsidised ones. But let's be honest, Britain doesn't publicly subsidise private schools. Eton gets no public money. America doesn't publicly subsidise private schools. There are very few countries that do, and those that do don't do it anywhere near the way we do.
Yeah.
It is a bizarre Australian development, and once upon a time, churches ran schools to support the children of their parishioners. These days, churches run schools so that their churches can remain vaguely relevant. Because if there weren't religious schools, all you would have is Hillsong and a few crumbling churches with rapidly aging and very small, worshippers, congregations. So it's really gone, the schools prop up the church now, not the church propping up the schools. And that's what it's for. It's for the perpetuation of religion. Yeah.
And I know a lot of like people who are atheists who there's this perception that private schools are better, so they end up sending their kids to these private schools, these religious schools, even though they themselves aren't religious.
Worse, sometimes they have to lie. Sometimes they have to actually go and attend a church a few times before they'll be able to get their kid in. So that's a really good way of teaching your children values, I would have thought. To have to lie about your beliefs to get your kid in.
That's
awesome, guys. Oh yeah, these schools are really morally superior, aren't they? Honestly, nothing makes me angrier. I see nothing as more willfully blind. In fact, my view is really quite radical. I reckon Australians are as blind to the damage the way we fund our education system does to our society and particularly to the future, as Americans are about how their attitude to guns stuffs their country up. We just can't see it because we won't see it. We refuse to see it. We won't look at the facts because it doesn't suit us. Parents' anxieties have been driven by marketing and vested interests to the point where they think that the person they need their kids to be most afraid of is their neighbour's children. That is so wrong. and they are terrified that their kid might end up sitting next to a poor kid. I mean, I've had so many people say to me, oh, it's dreadful that these schools are allowed, you know, to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. Well, yes, it is, of course, but they've been allowed to for a very long time. But I also wonder, if it's so bad to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, so if you're a gay kid, for example, or a trans kid, which I agree is dreadful, why is it okay that they can discriminate, even though they're in receipt of public money, against poor kids?
Yeah.
Why is discriminating against poor kids perfectly acceptable?
Yeah.
We really like it, actually, because our kids don't have to mix with them. And not conceived as discrimination at all.
Yeah, you never think about, or yeah, I guess most people don't even think about that, but it's so true. Like, it's okay to discriminate against some, but not others for some reason.
Yes, and if you're poor, anyone can discriminate against you for any reason, even if you're a child.
Yeah.
Okay, and we'll give them copious amounts of public money to help them do it.
It's just
okay.
It's just absolutely insane.
Yep, it is, and it doesn't save money.
Yeah.
The argument most often used now, oh, well, we're saving the government money by doing this. Well, an education system shouldn't be something you use to save money. An education system should be used to equitably and excellently educate every single child, regardless of who their parents are.
Yeah.
And also it doesn't save money.
On education, I used to live in Germany, and they have a really different culture around education to what we do. And I remember at the time I was in high school, and I had a German girlfriend while I was there, and she did very well at school, and all she wanted to do was become a teacher. And in Germany, like, teaching is like the most highly respected profession.
Same in Finland.
Yeah.
Teaching is an incredibly demanding job. It's emotionally very demanding. It's all about relationships. And so if you think you can do teaching as an easy backstop, then you're not going to last long in teaching, because it isn't like that at all. And it's very poorly paid.
Yeah. It doesn't get the respect
It doesn't get the respect.
Yeah.
No. Well, it's a feminised profession. None of the feminised professions get the respect they deserve. Now, yes, nurses get sentimentalised. To some extent, teachers get sentimentalised too. But we don't pay them, and we don't respect them as professionals. If we did, we would pay them properly. We have a very clear way of demonstrating the value that we place on people's contribution. It comes in the form of a paycheck. There is no clearer way of assessing someone's value than here's how much we're prepared to pay you, or what society thinks is their value. If it is a female-dominated profession, you will find, and this will shock you, that you are less valued and paid less. And we have a strong anti-intellectual tradition in Australia. We're suspicious of the mind, we're suspicious of the intellect, we're suspicious of people with ideas, and particularly suspicious of women with ideas. And so we've taken that anti-intellectualism out on teachers, and they're getting, I mean, there's chronic teacher shortages, and not just in public schools, but right across the whole education system. And that's because people have many alternative offerings, particularly if they're smart and highly qualified, which teachers are, and they've got alternatives, and often they take them. People who love teaching often love children and love adolescents and love watching them learn, and they get enormous rewards from that, but you can't pay the rent with that. And they leave often very reluctantly, but they leave, and that's a huge loss, not just to the kids themselves, but to all of us and to Australia's future. We're simply not educating our talent as equitably or as well as the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
We will pay for this.
Absolutely. We already are, and like the world is about to move into, you know, a big transformation. The third industrial revolution, the clean tech revolution is coming. And education's always been important, but it's more important now than ever. Because we need to educate people in the right areas to help with this transition, and there's going to be so many different important areas there. So yeah, I mean, if we do get a change of government, and you know, fingers crossed that we do, hopefully the incoming government, however it's made up, whether it's made up of a lot of liberal, lot of independents and whatnot. Hopefully, we do get a much stronger focus on education. You mentioned pay there, and this is probably a good segue into gender pay gap, which I'd really love to talk to you about as well.
Yeah, sure.
Obviously, in Australia, we still have a big gender pay gap.
Yep.
And again, it's always good to look at what these Scandinavian countries are doing. And one of the fascinating things that Norway did is a few years back, they decided to make everybody's income transparent and available on a public register.
Yeah, I read about this.
Yeah, which is really fascinating because what it means is that if you and I both worked for the same company, you could jump onto this register and check how much I was getting paid. So it's all transparent.
Yep.
And then when they did this, miraculously, the gender pay gap decreased in Norway.
What a shock.
Yeah.
What a surprise. Well, what's secrecy for? Secrecy about anything is usually to protect something, isn't it? And it's usually to protect a privilege of some kind. It might be the privilege that you know something that somebody else doesn't, or it might just be the privilege that, you know, you're able to earn more money without anyone feeling resentful or hard done by because they don't know that. So I think that's a great idea, because what we have in Australia still has one of the most gender segregated workforces in the OECD. So 60% of us work in a industry or a profession or whatever that's dominated by one gender or the other, and those that are dominated by men are paid more than those that are dominated by women. So as long as we have that severe gender segregation, we're going to have a gender pay gap, because women overwhelmingly work in what we see as caring professions: teaching, nursing, aged care, childcare, retail, service and caring. And we underpay those people. We exploit them horribly. We regard caring as of very little value, even though without it, we'd all fall apart.
Yeah.
We don't value it, and I think we don't value it because we see it as women's work.
Yep.
And we see it also as a woman's duty. It's our duty to care for others, and therefore we begrudge paying for it because we should be doing it. I mean, there was, I don't know if it still exists, but when I used to go to the cinema sometimes on the North Shore, I'd see these ads for a home care service, which was actually called Dutiful Daughters. Can't imagine one called Dutiful Sons, can you?
Yeah.
And that explains a lot about what we think women should do and what we're prepared to pay for, and how, in a way, calling that service Dutiful Daughters was a slap at all the daughters who weren't doing their duty. We really have very complex views of...
Just go with it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
What
Yeah, it's
women should do.
yeah, it's basically saying that telling women to stay in their place. Yeah.
You're there we are I used to call us the servant gender or the service gender. We're there to support others. We're not there to aspire to things ourselves. And what I love about all the women stepping forward at the moment, either as independents or representatives of small parties, and of course I'm one of them, is that we're saying, no, sod that. We are going to aspire for things for ourselves, not just for our own benefit, but because we've been watching what's been going on, and we've been thinking, well, you guys are just doing it for your benefit.
Yeah.
You're not really helping anyone else at all. In fact, you're getting in the way of helping others who desperately need some help right now, including our poor bruised planet. And I guess that we've all gotten impatient, and we've also gained enough confidence, I think, gained a sense that it's our right. My mother, she had lots of ideas and she really believed them, but she lacked the confidence. She lacked the sense that she had a right to it, and that's because no one around her, apart from my father, who was very supportive, but no one around her thought she did. And that's very hard to overcome.
Yeah.
That's changed. Women are supporting one another to aspire for things for themselves.
Yeah, and you've obviously been an observer of this for an observer and a participant of this of a very long time in Australia, and I wanted to get your thoughts on the last 12 months, this incredible women's movement that we've seen with people like Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame with their amazing speeches, and they're just two to name many.
Yes, there's Chanel Contos, there's Saxon Mullins, there's so many others that I can think of.
Yeah.
And not just in Australia, but there seems to be a preponderance of them here, or perhaps we're just more aware of them. Mahalia, for example, and Greta Thunberg. There seems to be a real revolution amongst young women who have just decided they're not going to defer. They're not going to accept the old-fashioned notion that they were silly little flibbity-gibbets who knew nothing and should get quiet at all. And they are going to grasp the nettle and take action. And also, and most importantly, and I think this applies to Saxon and Brittany and Grace in particular, they're going to tell the truth about their lives. And they're going to tell the truth about the horrors perpetrated upon them, and they're not going to carry the shame of it. And until very recently, until 2017 really, you can date it from the #MeToo explosion, women carried the shame if they were sexually assaulted or sexually harassed or bullied out of their jobs. Women carried the shame if their husband beat them or coercively controlled them or refused to let them have their money. Women felt ashamed of it, and yet the shame didn't belong to women. Women weren't doing the wrong thing. The shame belonged to the blokes who were doing it. And finally, we appear to be refusing to accept that shame and giving it back to the people to whom it belongs.
Yeah, and it seems like I'll just pass this. It seems like the women that are stepping up, they're just inspiring more and more women, and it's just growing.
As soon as the silence gets shattered, it has no power anymore.
Yeah.
And so the overwhelming silence about women and their lived experience, which applied to so many things, it didn't just apply to abuse and assault. It also applied to things like menstruation and menopause. And even for many, like being pregnant, you were supposed to pretend you weren't. The whole area of women's lives, their bodies were meant to be shrouded in secrecy and shame. And that really erased us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
And that really erased us. It erased us not just from the rest of society, but from ourselves. And we couldn't tell people. I mean, one of the saddest things I read in Julia Baird's fantastic biography of Queen Victoria, that she died. And after she died in her 80s, they found that she had had a prolapsed uterus, I think, which would have been extremely painful and uncomfortable. And she must have had it for decades. And she'd never told a soul, because of course you weren't allowed to talk about those things, even if you were queen. And so no wonder she was a bit of a grumpy old woman. She was in pain and never told anyone. One of the most poignant things about the #MeToo movement was when you saw tweets from women in their 80s and 90s who had been assaulted or abused when they were girls and had never, not once, breathed a word of it to anyone. And finally they were telling their story. You know, a therapist said to me once, and I've never forgotten it, you're only as sick as your biggest secret. Think of how long women have held men's secrets. I'm so glad we're not doing that anymore, and I think it's liberated a whole lot of energy, and I think young women like Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame have taken hold of that energy and they're running with it, and it's so good to see. I'm so proud, not of them, I have no right to be proud of them, they have a right to be proud of them. I'm so proud of my generation of feminists who fought tougher odds in many ways, but survived. All right, we couldn't do the things that Grace and Brittany and others can do now because the times didn't give us permission. But we did manage to get into the workforce, which my mother's generation had even more difficulty doing. And we managed to stay there, even if we had to make compromises to do that. And by staying there, we gave encouragement to the next generation of girls to feel that they could take the next step forward, which they're doing. And I think twas ever thus. I think each generation of women have chipped away at, it's supposed to be the glass ceiling, but I prefer, it's an American feminist, I think Lauren Lissie's definition. She says there's no such thing as a glass ceiling. There's just a thick layer of men. And we've been chipping away at that thick layer of men for a very long time.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of daylight to be seen now. It's good.
Yeah, and my background, I guess, is climate activism, and was part of Extinction Rebellion for a couple of years. And when you start with XR, depends where you are, but like you learn a lot about social movements of the past. And one of the things that we kind of look at and draw inspiration from is the suffragette movement and the incredible things that women did back then to win the right to vote. They were doing, I didn't know this until the last couple of years, but like women were being locked out of their homes. They were going on hunger strikes. They were doing all kinds of...
They were getting force-fed.
Force-fed, yeah. And fighting for the right to vote. And it's really difficult to imagine what life must have been like for women before even the right to vote. And you talk about chipping away, like it's just remarkable that like the foundations get laid and then they get built on.
That's why they try to stop you laying the foundations.
Yeah.
I've often argued, you remember when we had, and it's interesting how the same arguments come up all the time. When there was the equal marriage debate, back a few years now, when Malcolm Turnbull was holding the plebiscite on it, people kept using the argument it'll destroy the family, it's bad for children, a child needs a mother and a father, all this kind of rhetoric, right? It's unnatural, whatever else they want to say. Precisely the same arguments were used by those who opposed votes for women. Precisely the same. It'll destroy the family, it's not natural, it's not, children need a mother and a father, and a mother's role is this, and a father's role is that, and blah, 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 blah. And exactly the same thing happened. In the end, those arguments failed because they're self-interested and demonstrably stupid. And the equal marriage became law here and in places like Ireland and almost everywhere that's sensible. And votes for women are virtually universal. They're still not universal, but virtually universal. And I kept saying, it'll be just like votes for women. Once it's passed, no one will ever mention it again.
Yeah.
It doesn't affect anyone else.
It's
once it's passed, you sort of go, what was the fuss about?
Yeah, the amount of commotion that was caused around equal marriage, marriage equality, it's like it never even happened.
It's like, and who cares? No one cares.
Yeah.
No one cares. It's just I'm hearing exactly the same arguments now against trans women in particular. There seems to be less of a fuss around trans men, which I also find quite interesting. But around trans women, they shouldn't be allowed to use women's toilets. You want to let men in. And I think to myself, do you think the sign "ladies" is enough to keep on its own to keep a would-be rapist out? Do you? Are you crazy? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's it destroys the family, it puts women at risk. It's risky. They'll do this, they'll do that. They take, the absolute exception on the exception on the exception, and say so therefore we must oppress all these people because of this tiny thing that might once in a blue moon be a problem. And it's the same thing. It's none of your business. It's not an issue. Accept people as they are.
Yeah.
Why should you care? I don't understand why anyone cares.
Well, why are they so... this is the thing that links all the movements, really, is that the status quo, the incumbents, are threatened by this shift. Why?
Yeah. Well, partly, I think, it has to do with religion and the control that religion has had on people's lives for millennia. And religion set the rules, and the people who ran the religions or were favoured by those religions, and certainly under patriarchal religions like Islam and Christianity, men were favoured by those religions. And so religion worked very well to keep the powerful in power and to keep the rest of us accepting of their power. I've often argued religion is made for men, by men, and about men. And so a lot of it is to do, and you will find that the opposition, when you're a feminist and you're fighting for rights, so if you're fighting for voting rights, or you're fighting for reproductive rights, or you're fighting for any kind of right that you care to name, you find suddenly somewhere that you're fighting a church. Always. And I think the LGBTQI community would probably say the same. Now, that doesn't mean that all people with faith are anti-progressive or conservative or don't agree with reproductive rights and equal marriage and are perfectly lovely to trans kids. Of course, people with faith are often extremely open and generous-hearted and vigorous in their defence of human rights. Absolutely. But the institutions, particularly for those who I think really rely on dogma, who really rely on a set of rules that everyone has to obey, and God will reward you if you obey those rules and punish you if you don't. If that's the kind of religion they really like, they are very threatened by anything that says, well, you know, time's moved on, we don't have to obey those old rules anymore, because that threatens the absolute basis of their view of the world, which is that it is hierarchical, rule-based, and based on reward and punishment.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I want to tie that to the issue of climate change now, because even though it doesn't seem apparent to begin with, we'll go left up here. Religion also has an impact on our ability to take action on climate change. It doesn't seem apparent straight up, but basically the belief that God is in control of the world seems like a benign belief, but actually it's not, because humans are changing the chemical composition of the Earth's atmosphere, and we're putting ourselves at massive risk. And it's really important for humanity to acknowledge the impact that we're having on our beautiful little blue fragile planet that's our home. And I know that there are a lot of religious groups out there that want to see climate action as well, so acknowledge those. But yeah, I think that religion also has a really negative impact on our respect for science and our ability to acknowledge this problem and take action.
I think you're absolutely right, and indeed there is much in the Bible, I believe, not that I've ever read it. I did go to Sunday school for a short time. My mother was horrified. That says that man has dominion over the earth and all the planets, and that in a way God made the Garden of Eden, Earth, for our use. And so that means we use it and we can exploit it any way we like. And I think there is a belief that when you say no, man doesn't have dominion over the earth. We are just another species that has evolved, and as soon as we become dangerous to the earth, my suspicion is the earth will bloody get rid of us quick smart. That offends, again, a whole set of very ancient beliefs about hierarchy, and patriarchal religions are very hierarchical. Now, from what I understand of Jesus as an amateur outside observer, he wasn't particularly hierarchical at all. But the people who've come after seem to have forgotten a lot of that. And it's very hierarchical. And it's about exploiting women, your own children. It's about exploiting resources, animals, all sorts of things. And you're allowed to do that because you're a good, God-fearing man, and therefore that's your reward for being a God-fearing man. And my problem is that for the very religious, the problem is that it does, look, and people are going to howl at me when I say this, but okay, this is my view, my observation. If the answer to every question is God, then you're not going to ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And that is a problem when we're dealing with a world that is changing as quickly as our world is.
Yep.
And I fear that some of the people in positions of power have an almost nihilistic view, that they would rather see the whole thing blow up than give up on their patriarchal, hierarchical beliefs. That doesn't mean they have to give up on believing in God, although I don't need to. It doesn't bother me that I don't believe in God, but I know that for a lot of people it's very important. And that doesn't mean you don't believe in a higher power, but it does mean you accept that perhaps when God said, as I believe he did, or she did, the Lord helps those who help themselves, that could apply to saving the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we're stitching together a lot of different topics here and trying to draw out the common theme here, and I think maybe it's hierarchy, right?
Yeah,
and
it is.
And
Power and privilege,
centralization, and now I want to talk about what we talked about on the way up here, which is these structures of hierarchy and how they manifest themselves in the real world, in the real world, right? So we've talked about a few already. I want to talk about energy now, and hierarchical centralized energy, and how this is something I've been banging on for about 12 months. And if we look at coal, oil and gas, fossil fuels, they're all forms of centralized hierarchical energy, which, so that, you know, these coal assets, the coal mines, the power plants, they're owned by a handful of companies, and those companies are owned by a handful of people, generally men.
Yes.
And
those who have the power, those who own the power have the power.
yeah, and basically with fossil fuels, they're centralized, and we're all dependent on them for our power, right? So when you turn your lights on at your home, if it's run off a coal-fired power station, you're paying money to these centralized hierarchical structures. But the incredible thing about renewables, and coupled with electric vehicles, is that they are forms of decentralized energy. And you know, if you get together with your community, or even at a household level, you stick solar panels on your roof, you get a community-owned battery, your community builds a wind farm, you're basically taking energy away from that hierarchy, and with that comes political power.
You're taking the power
away
from the powerful. That's feminism's song.
Yeah.
Feminism is a revolutionary movement designed to distribute power more equitably.
Yeah.
You're describing the move to renewable energy as a revolutionary movement designed to distribute literal power, but also metaphorical power more equitably. So what we have is a world where the population, and basically the kind of way technology is developed, the way the climate is responding to the way technology has developed, it's all driving us in the same direction. This is going to happen, and what we have is a bunch of those who gain the most advantage from things staying as they are, with a few powerful, very rich people at the top doing everything they know how to do to stop that change occurring.
Yeah.
And if you think about what's happened in the media, even, we were talking about this before, that it mirrors exactly what's going on with the idea of the decentralization of energy and therefore power. And because, you know, once we were under the control, really, we talked about a free press, but the press was all owned by media barons. You know, they were owned by mega wealthy people.
Well, just on that, just quickly, I mean, like Kerry Stokes, right, who owns Channel 7 and West Media, Seven Group Holdings also owns a string of oil and gas plants, right?
Yeah.
They're literally, the fossil fuel barons own the media, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So it's these barons of industry, captains of industry, and billionaires who are staring a terrifying future in the face, where they suddenly just become, you know, not that much more powerful than a whole lot of other people, and they lose their. Well, Kerry Packer lost the rivers of gold, didn't he? In the classified ads a long time ago.
Yeah.
And so basically, they're losing their income streams, or they face losing their income streams, and that's what they're terrified of. Look, it's understandable. Nobody gives up power without a fight. Women have discovered that, as they have fought for the last, I don't know how many hundreds of years, to get some power from men. Men fight back. They don't want to give any of it up. In the end, though, there's a sort of momentum that moves it forward, and I think we're seeing and the media is shattered into 1,000 million mobile phones, basically.
Yeah.
All over the world.
Yeah.
And so they can no longer hold on to the power, and they don't make the money out of it that they used to. The business model has broken. And I think that is probably what is going to happen if our energy companies don't recognise that they need to move.
Yeah.
The Sydney Morning Herald didn't have to give up on real estate ads. It just needed to move them online. Now it has done with Domain.
Yeah.
But it didn't at first. It gave it up.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same with energy companies. We're still going to need energy. Maybe there's ways you could find to be part of it. Kodak almost disappeared because it thought it was a film. It made film for cameras. No, it made memories for purchases.
Yeah, exactly.
It should have gone
didn't
into
understand what it was actually making.
It should have gone into the phone business.
Yeah. I feel like we're getting into some really interesting territory here, and another thing that's really fascinating with the transition to this decentralized renewable energy, and I'll just mention, like, electric vehicles are part of that, because if you're charging your electric vehicle off your homegrown, community-owned renewable energy, you're actually flipping the bird to the oil industry, and you're no longer needing oil or fuel, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, in Australia, we have over 20 million vehicles which run on petrol and diesel, and like 90% of our fuel is imported, right?
Yeah.
So 90% of all the cars and trucks that are part of our economy, 90% of the fuel isn't even made here in Australia.
You could shut us down in a week.
A couple of fuel lines if they get cut, right?
Yep.
This is the other massive opportunity for renewables and electric vehicles, is that if we totally transition to electric vehicles and 100% renewables, we're powering our entire economy from homegrown Aussie energy.
And isn't that in a way what COVID has forced us to do? Because COVID really rebuilt walls between nations because of the need to keep, possible infection out, we had to be throwing much more on our own resources. And people are starting to manufacture things again here that they'd stopped manufacturing a long time ago, and we had to import it all, including vaccines.
Yeah.
There's sort of been a turn back towards, actually, when you're totally dependent on just in time bringing in from overseas for all your basic needs, you're very vulnerable.
Yeah.
You can really find yourself without the stuff you have to manage your society properly and to keep your population healthy and protected.
Yeah.
So I think that is almost starting to happen there. But you also made me think with the idea of the decentralising generally, is that's also what the rise of the independents is doing. It is also breaking a monopoly, a duopoly, if you like. Not completely, because we will always need and have bigger parties, whether they stay the same two parties or some of the smaller ones get bigger because they're successful, I don't know. The party system is probably inevitable. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go off the road to get past these two. It's probably inevitable in the way our parliamentary system works. But the independents are also fragmenting it. Yeah. They are doing the same thing. They're saying we don't want these big, powerful entities with heavy vested interests that are about their own agendas rather than us, our needs, wants and wishes. We need more diverse representation. And when you think about what diverse representation actually means. It means decentralising power.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really exciting development in Australian politics. And I've obviously had discussions with a number of these independent candidates over the last few weeks, and every conversation I have is just so fascinating, right? To see this playing out in Australian politics, I think, is incredibly exciting. And there's a real chance that we're going to see a minority government after this election, which we shouldn't be afraid of.
No.
It's the norm. And actually, like, if you think of things in the limit, and I want to just briefly talk about Elon Musk here, because Elon Musk is, I think, very much misunderstood by a lot of people, but Elon has kind of revolutionized engineering thinking, right? And he's got a number of philosophies around engineering and life in general, but one of them is thinking in the limit. And let's think of Australian Parliament in the limit, where it's 151 independents, right? Like, that's kind of what like democracy originally would have been about.
Of course it was.
About
yes.
that. Yeah.
But it wasn't particularly representative, because early democracy was a male only, and for a long time it was householders, so you had to own property.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So when we started to get proper representative democracy, one person, one vote, which really wasn't until 1900s, really. If you include women in the human race, which I do, then there became, parties had already begun to develop. They developed even more after that. And I think part of the reason is that if you're going to get things done, you do have to get agreement and get enough votes. And so what I think works well is a loose party structure. What we have in Australia is quite a rigid party structure, so that we're very opposed to anyone crossing the floor. And it's big news, if Trent Zimmerman crosses the floor.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure Trent Zimmerman crossed the floor on the religious discrimination bill because he genuinely despises it, but he also did it because Kylie Tink in North Sydney is really rattling his cage, and he needs to look to his constituency. So in a way, the independents are already starting to have an effect on the decentralisation of power without even getting elected yet.
Amazing. Yeah.
I know. And so basically, in other countries, they often have many more smaller parties and a couple of big ones. Germany's an example. Took ages for the world to know and for them to work out who was going to be the next chancellor after Angela Merkel. Yeah. Because they had to do a whole lot of wheeling and dealing with all the different parties, none of whom had got a clear majority.
Yeah. That's normal.
Yeah, perfectly effective system of government. New Zealand is certainly very similar. Jacinda Ardern did not get in with a majority in her own right the first time round. She had to negotiate with Winston Peters, or he sort of sprung her on the parliament, I think, a bit. So there's nothing anti-democratic or particularly difficult about a minority government having to negotiate with a whole bunch of stakeholders about how that government will run. So I'm not afraid of that at all. And we particularly need, I think, that diversity in the Senate, because the Senate is the House of Review. It needs to look at the legislation that the House of Representatives have passed and decide whether that legislation is beneficial. Now, if you just have majority and a tight hold between two parties, one side are always going to say it's beneficial and the other side are always going to say it isn't. So you actually need a few disinterested votes, people in there who are going to say, well, let me have a look at it.
Yeah.
What do I think? I'm here not to keep my party in power, but to make sure that ordinary people's views are represented.
Yeah.
So how does that work? So that's why it's really actually quite important to have some independent voices alongside the parties. But also, if the parties had less rigid discipline, we'd see, for example, in America, people cross the floor all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not and they have a division, they cross the floor. In Britain, they cross the floor all the time.
Yeah.
It's only in Australia that it's like, no, they mustn't cross the floor.
Yeah.
And that's created a system which represents more, unfortunately, sometimes, the desires of the party for the benefit of the party, not necessarily for the public.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to work that way. Big parties aren't intrinsically bad, but they do need a few checks and balances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recently took the independent candidate for McKellar, Sophie Scomps, and she told a story that I think she'd spoken to Zali Steggall about it, and Zali had said there's a story when Craig Kelly went to the crossbench, he asked the other crossbenchers, so how do you know how to vote?
Well, that is the one worry, and that is if we get too many loonies or too many people who actually don't understand how the parliament works, getting into positions of power, we can get all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
So we do have to think very carefully about who we're voting for and why we're voting for them, and what we want them to do, and whether we think they're able to be sane and disinterested. And ideology has too much of a hold on a lot of people, and also religious ideology, but not just religious ideology. It can be, I want to keep the powerful and the privileged in power because that will benefit me. I'll get a good job at the end of this, or I get great donations for my political campaign. And that can really heavily influence decisions that are being taken.
Yeah.
And not just by big parties, but by independents who may be in the pocket of, or have very big pockets themselves, and I'm not referring to anyone in particular.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really fascinating moment in Australian political history, or Australian history in general right now. And like, I've recently said this to a few people, but like the
What am I doing?
just getting a bit close to the line there, but that's okay if you just come into the middle a bit more. But yeah, on just getting back to climate for a sec, like the result of the upcoming, oh, look at that.
Goanna!
Wow. Big goanna.
Beautiful creature.
Yeah. The result of the election that's going to happen within the next 90 days will determine how much carbon dioxide is in the Earth's atmosphere in 10 or 20 years' time, right?
Oh, God.
And the conversations and the things that happen in the next 90 days will determine the outcome of that election, right? So it's a pretty remarkable moment in history that we're in now.
And isn't it fascinating that sometimes it looks to me as if, look, worthy though the efforts of many of the independents, of the Labor Party, of people like me and the Reason Party may be, that it's the climate that will end up defeating this government. That it's the reality of climate change and their refusal to do anything about it. And they did the same thing to those people who were sounding the alarm about climate change and the urgent need for action that they'd done to feminists for as long as you can imagine. They sneered, they mocked, they ridiculed, they dismissed. It's a particular tone of voice which tries to claim the high moral ground and sound superior. I know better than you, you stupid, idiotic people.
Climate change is crap.
Yeah, climate change is crap. Oh, yeah. And so what about this then? This period of time. Cherry picking the figures. You know, there's no such thing as a gender pay gap. Women just choose to work in industries that pay less because we just love being poor. It's our natural state. All that crap. And it's the same tone. Just like the arguments against equal marriage or against transgender people's rights were the same as the arguments against votes for women. So the tone of voice about dismissing climate change and ridiculing the people who could see the writing on the wall, clear and urgent, is the same. And in the end, you kind of know that means they know they're losing, and reality will bite.
Reality has bitten them in the last couple of weeks with these massive catastrophic floods that we've seen, which have like ruined thousands of people's lives, destroyed thousands of homes, and we're now seeing this real anger come to the surface.
Well, these people will never be able to insure their home. And we've created a society where for most ordinary Australians, their major asset, the thing they think they're going to rely on when they get old and retire, is their family home.
Mm-hmm.
And if they can't insure it, they can't sell it. It hasn't got any value.
Mm-hmm.
So they've shot themselves in the foot.
Yeah. I mean, it's tragic what's happened with these floods, and we can compare them with the fires that happened a couple of years ago. Now, the fires happened after the last election. These floods are happening a couple
Just
months
before.
before the election, right? And you probably saw this on Twitter the last few days, but some young person on TikTok put together this incredible montage of all these climate denying statements that Scott Morrison has, and overlaid that with the horrific imagery that we've seen from the bushfires, from the floods, from these extreme weather events that are now happening so regularly. And that video went viral on TikTok. It then got shared on Twitter. It went viral on Twitter. It went viral on Insta. And I actually asked the guy who made it to let me know how many views it had. And he kind of listed off, he thought it had 500,000 here, 500,000 there. It was over 2 million across the platforms, right? That's just the ones that he knew about, right?
And it'll have gone further because it'll have gone on Facebook and email and all sorts of places. I saw it and I said, Morrison's dead.
Yeah.
Morrison's dead. This is the entire argument in a nutshell.
Yeah.
You, sir, took a lump of coal into the parliament and sneered and ridiculed those who said this is dangerous, deadly dangerous, and here is the consequences of your refusal to take that warning seriously. You, sir.
Yep, and this is, again, come back to this concept of decentralization. This is a young person has with their phone or their laptop put together this video in such a beautiful, artistic way, and reached millions of people.
Yep.
That is democracy.
That is democracy in action. It is the fragmentation, and it is the revolutionary movement away from centralised power towards a more equitable distribution of power. And it's what I've wanted to see all my life.
Yeah.
It's what I fought for all my life. And it's what equity means. Equity means everybody has some of the power, not just a few, and that we all serve them. It's interesting, because I'm a bit of an amateur history buff. I was very interested in COVID from the point of view of the plague in the 1300s, because in the 1300s, when the plague hit Europe, the Black Death, it was devastating. It wiped out a huge percentage of the population, and it also meant that a great many people were too ill to work for a very long time. The consequences of the plague in Europe lasted for about 50 years, and direct consequences. And I was privileged enough to go around Exeter Cathedral a few years ago, and they showed us the top, they were taking us around, and they said, can you see that line of stones where they go from lighter to darker right at the top of the wall? And we all looked up and went, oh yeah, we can. They said that happened in the year, and they gave us the year, I can't remember it now, 13 something. That's when the plague hit Exeter, and that's when everyone got so sick and so many people died that they had no stonemasons to continue the work on the cathedral, which is half finished. So they just stopped work on it, and for 50 years the stones that they'd cut to finish the work sat outside in the weather, and they darkened. And then after 50 years, when there were enough workers again to actually finish the job, they put them in the cathedral, and we can see the exact point, the exact year where the plague hit Exeter. Now, the plague in Europe, the Black Death, destroyed serfdom. It put an end to serfdom. It was the beginning of the guilds, which is the beginning of the union movement. It increased living standards and wages for the people who were left, because there were so few able-bodied people around to do the work, they had to pay them more money to get them to do it. We're starting to see a little bit of that happening now.
Yeah.
That wages are having to go up for a lot of people because you can't get people to fill the jobs.
Yeah. There's also the Great Resignation.
And the Great Resignation is happening. People are going, I don't think this job's worth the candle.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested that COVID also has accelerated the rate of change. That we have to start changing a society that is now only working to the benefit of a tiny few and not for the benefit of most people.
Yeah, and crises throughout history are an accelerant for change. And another thing we talked about earlier is this horrific invasion of the Ukraine that's happening now. And there's just phenomenal videos coming out of incredible courage being shown by the people of Ukraine, led by their leader Zelensky, who's
Turned into
just
a hero.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to social media. A lot of it's being driven through social media, and information is being spread through social media. But one of the things we spoke about earlier is the possibility that this horrific conflict, there may be some good that comes out of it, in that it accelerates us again towards renewable energy, because the Russians, obviously Putin gets a lot of his power from his monopoly over oil and gas.
Yeah, absolutely. And as he is being boycotted, quite rightly, I think, on every level, and there is now, I believe, boycotts. I don't know if they've gone as far as oil and gas yet, but I think they must be thinking about it.
I think they're getting there, yeah.
Yeah, then it starts to point out to us, in a way, how vulnerable not just the ordinary person's dependence on oil and gas is, but how vulnerable those who would be autocrats, those who would rule the world are if they rely on oil and gas. That in fact, anyone who's a bit more far-sighted is going to have to be thinking, I may need to change my business plan. I don't think this is going to keep working for much longer. And Putin may in fact be defeated by the very thing he thought was his power base.
Yep.
It's horrifying what's happening in Ukraine, but it's also indicative of the weakness of our democracies, because this is a repeat of 1939 in many ways. And what Hitler saw was war-exhausted democracies after the First World War, who didn't want to fight and weakened, not particularly robust at that time. And he did what autocrats always do, pushed against what he saw as a weakness, right? That's what Putin's doing. He sees Biden and NATO as weak, and he, I think, probably helped to weaken it via the election of Trump. And he's pushing against it. But it's not going the way he'd hoped.
No.
And I think you're right. I think the reason it's not going the way he hoped is not because the democracies aren't weak, though I don't think they're quite as weak as Putin thought, or even perhaps I feared, now that I'm seeing them cooperating together. But they're also because ordinary citizens are able to get information out.
Yeah.
And ordinary citizens are able to respond to that information and give their governments permission to impose harsh sanctions.
Yep.
Even if there's going to be a slight cost for us at home if we impose those sanctions. I think because of what we've seen, because of Zelensky's brilliance, really, and his extraordinary courage, we sort of feel like, look at what that guy's risking.
Yeah.
I guess we can pay a little bit of a price here by boycotting some imports that we used to buy, or no longer selling some of the things we used to sell to Russia. So, yes, again, the old-style oligarchs, and Putin is old-style, like worse than Trump, don't know what's in them and never factor it in.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Putin wasn't expecting the amount of resistance that's come from the Ukrainian people. He was expecting to go in and take Kiev like within a few days.
He thought he'd just march in there and it'd all be over Red Rover. And he's clearly narcissistic, which most of these people are. So He believes his own publicity. He actually apparently thought that the Ukrainians would be delighted to return to the bosom of Mother Russia, and under Putin's not exactly benign rule. And he has, as narcissists can never cope with, discovered just how unlovely he is and unloved.
And you got to feel sorry for a lot of the Russians who are in this information vacuum. They don't have access. A lot of them don't have access to the internet, or the internet they've got is highly censored, and they're only seeing the state media.
Yeah. But there have been protests.
Yeah.
In Russia, even so, because they've still got their phones and they can still go via other channels.
Yeah.
If they're young and smart. My husband, who used to do a lot of business with China, never mind, noticed when he was there, he said he remembers he was watching CNN or one of the international services, and a story came on about something from the BBC, and it immediately just closed down. The station just closed down.
Wow.
Oh,
this is fascinating, because the other thing that happened over the last couple of weeks, and this is again, I think Elon Musk and his companies are really misunderstood by a lot of people. A lot of people think that SpaceX is about like this escape thing for some people to go escape to Mars or whatever, and it's
Planet
really
B.
and it's really not. It's really not about that. And like a big project that SpaceX has been working on is called Starlink, and Starlink is going to be this 40,000 small satellites, low orbit satellites, right? That will be orbiting the planet and will provide high speed internet to any square meter on the planet, anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And currently, so what's enabled this technology is those incredible landing rockets, which you've seen, reusable rockets. So the genius of the reusable rocket is that it's dramatically reduced the cost of putting things up into space, because normally you would use a big rocket, you'd spend all this money building a rocket, and then you'd fire it off and it would crash to Earth, and then you've lost it.
That's
right?
It's
SpaceX are able to continuously
single use.
So because SpaceX spent all that time and energy developing these reusable rockets, they can now put these small satellites, thousands of them, into the atmosphere, and they've got about 2,000 up there already, and that was enough to do two things in the last couple months. When the volcano happened in Tonga, SpaceX was able to send some of their terminals, they've got these terminals in boxes, and provide internet to people in Tonga for communications when their communications were cut. And then more recently, we've seen the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine request help from Elon Musk. They sent thousands of Starlink terminals to Ukraine to provide access there, which is just amazing.
It's the fragmentation, the decentralization again. Well, it's interesting. I hadn't thought of that use of it because I can be a bit slow. But our country property, we've got satellite Wi-Fi because we'll never get cable. Too remote. And the Wi-Fi we've been receiving has been improving and improving and improving. Whereas at home in Sydney, it hasn't. Yeah. But up there it has. And when we hear about this, we think, of course, oh my God, we're going to have way better Wi-Fi there. Because we're never going to go into sort of a hiatus at all. And this is an even better kind of use of it, that it allows people to have access to the internet, even when those who would stop them having it are doing their damnedest to do that.
Yep. So imagine when they get the system up and going, imagine if and these terminals, you can all you need is power, right?
Yep.
You plug it in and you've got access to high-speed internet. They've even created an adapter for a cigarette lighter for people in Ukraine, so that when they're on the road, they can still get access. Now, what is this when these terminals start reaching Russia or China? How does that impact these oligarchs, their ability to control communications?
Oh, wow, fantastic. This is the most kind of positive, hopeful conversation I've had in such a long time.
Yeah.
Like, because suddenly I can see this kind of central theme of what's going on, and it is everywhere. The shattering of the old dead hands that held everything under them, that sort of squished them down, and it's like they're going, they're just exploding up and out. And it's wonderful to see. And it's what makes me think there's an inevitability to it is every sector you look at, that's what's going on.
Exactly.
Every single sector you look at, that's what's going on.
It's unstoppable now. It really is. And
climate change is still stopping.
It is. We're going to lose. We're going to lose a lot, and there's going to be hard times ahead. But we have the technology to act quickly. We can do this much faster than people think. Again, and I just want to briefly talk about Elon again.
Sure.
Sorry, because again, I feel like people put him in the same category as your Bezos or your Branson.
I'm not quite sure which one's which, to be perfectly honest with you.
Bezos is your Amazon.
Yeah, I kind of know when I think about it, but all your tech billionaires, gazillionaires, to me are sort of, they're those people who do things up there.
I think there's a lot that most are driven by money, but I feel like, and this is the culture. Ego, sure.
Richard Branson. Ooh.
Yeah. They're buying islands and yachts and stuff like that. And I'd say the people who are running Tesla, they're not driven by that. They're driven by change, and the mission of Tesla. You know, like a lot of companies, they'll have a mission statement, but no one really gives a shit what it is, right?
It's a kind of tick box.
Yeah. Well, with Tesla, the mission is the mission, and the mission is to accelerate the transition to clean technology. It's not about making money. The shareholders, Tesla shareholders, they're not your general Wall Street shareholders. They're generally geeks who follow Tesla, and they don't pay dividends, right? So there's no profits. They don't care about profits. They want to back this company and see them change the world and develop these technologies which allow decentralization to happen. And that's what they're doing with cars like this, and with the satellites and all this kind of stuff. So you couple that with social media, the right social media. You couple that with the social movements that are happening with your Grace Tames and your Greta Thunbergs, and this transition is going to happen much faster than.
Well, you can sort of feel it happening. I can feel it when I go and speak to groups, and the response is almost universally positive, and more than that, there's a real sense of hope. It's like when you hear this stuff, suddenly going from, oh my God, we're all doomed. Don't Look Up, that film that was made, which I quite enjoyed. But nevertheless, it had a we're all doomed kind of feeling to it. And it's so good when you can talk about the fact that, in fact, if we just grasp the nettle of changing the way we do a few things, like who we elect to represent us in Parliament, how we feel, for example, about maybe a bit more government intervention.
Yeah, you got to floor it here, by the way, when this turns green. Just, go, hit it. You can never miss an opportunity.
Can I say your definition of floor and mine are maybe slightly different?
Can I just tell a quick story on that?
Go on.
So I've recently moved to Canberra from Melbourne, and I work at a think tank, and each day I drive to work, I go like a quarter of the way around Parliament House. Then I go to work, and then on the way home I do the last 3/4 on the way back. And if I'm lucky, I'll get to stop at like 5 stoplights during the day. And generally... Okay. You're not a petrol head, but you are, sorta. Yeah, I'm an electro head or something like that.
Or maybe you're a speed freak.
Yeah, but I always hope, and I'm sure this has happened, that there might be a few old white male politicians around me in the traffic, and they see me just like zip off.
Or they
from
just
the line.
tut to themselves. We're going to go past my old high school soon.
Oh, nice.
Yes, my teenage stamping ground around here.
Yeah.
It's a lovely part of Sydney.
It's beautiful, yeah.
The boondocks of the Northern Beaches.
Yeah.
Very nice. Look, it's so exciting looking at the future when you see what we could be doing, and if we change this government, we have got so many natural advantages to do this stuff. And yet,
You're gonna let that guy get away with that?
yeah, I am.
Okay.
I'm an old lady. We don't compete.
But just on
we
that,
don't
look at
compete
the
with
look at the
dickheads
disgusting
like him.
yeah, look at the disgusting stuff coming out the back of it.
I
Though.
know.
It's just
revolting. I know. No, we don't compete with
No.
assholes like that. Oh my goodness. We've watched
beyond-
them all
we're
our
beyond that.
lives and gone, oh God, very small penis. Usually proved right.
yeah.
If not small penis, then small brain.
Mm-hmm. It's just wild.
It's like a beast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like a rhinoceros.
Where were we? Sorry.
I can't
think you.
Oh, about hope and the fact that when, if we change this government, and I do have a feeling that this is a really pivotal election, like it's really important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a way the government itself knows that. That's why they're so frantic.
Mm-hmm.
Because they can see that if we change this government, if we get some independents that are going to hold Labor's to the sticking point,
Mm-hmm.
because what we want is a house where there is a majority. I personally think, well, it doesn't have to be a majority, but the Labor forms the government, and we have enough progressive candidates elected that it can pull the Labor Party a little bit further to the left than it feels able to go. I think a lot of people in the Labor Party would like to see that happen too.
Yeah.
What we don't want is the opposite, where we have a Labor government, but we have a whole lot of people in the House of Reps and the Senate who are actually going to be pulling the Labor Party away from what it would like to do.
Yeah.
That is the real danger of what might happen.
Yeah. And so, all right, let's paint the picture now. Imagine that we do get a really progressive crossbench in the lower house and the Senate. What do you think's possible? What could Australia look like if we get the right decision makers in now? What could Australia look like in 5-10 years' time?
Well, I think we might not be the 60th worst country in the OECD in terms of getting our emissions under control. I think we might be able to hold our head up. I mean, one of the things I was humiliated about with these floods was I knew those pictures would be going all over the world and in news programs all over the world, and I also knew that people would watch them and think, well, what did they think was going to happen? They kind of deserve it. They've been dragging their heels and stuffing it up for everybody else. I'm not even going to feel any sympathy for them. I mean, how humiliating for Australia to find itself in that position, and impossible to argue against that attitude, actually. So I hope that in itself will have changed, and that we will be working with the rest of the world in a collaborative fashion to save this planet, to make sure that extinctions are as limited as they can possibly be, because we've already in Australia, I think, caused more extinctions of native animals in the last 100 years than any other country. Do we want to continue that record? Gee, I hope we don't. I think we might see a more diverse attitude to all sorts of issues, because we'll have more diverse people actually sitting there and contemplating them.
Yeah.
We might actually look at poverty in this country, and instead of regarding it as all your own fault or evidence that God doesn't love you very much or some such other shit, we might actually decide that we want to do something and help bring... JobKeeper and JobSeeker lifted 1 million people out of poverty.
Yeah.
And then we shoved them back down into it again.
Yeah, and we also were able to house homeless people at the start of the pandemic, because miraculously all these places became available, right?
Yeah.
They were always there.
Yeah. We just never wanted to actually let homeless people be in them, because, I mean, it's all of those things. I would like to see us take a sensible view of our society and say, we don't want to stymie innovation and hard work and entrepreneurship. No, of course we don't. That's great. But we don't see that to help those who, for all sorts of reasons, find themselves in difficult circumstances, that we have to hold them down to let the others go up. I don't believe that. I just don't believe that's the way it has to work or should work, frankly. And so I don't believe in the scarcity model. I don't believe that we all have to fight each other tooth and nail for a limited pie.
Yeah.
I actually think we can collaborate with one another to make a bigger pie, of which all of us, we won't get exactly the same slice. I don't see that ever happening. But where more of us get a fairer slice, and those people who, you know, come from families of intergenerational poverty, suffer mental health issues, have been victims of domestic violence, you know, all the things that can, or a health crisis, all the things that can drag people into poverty, which they never expected to happen, or they're born into poverty, that we can still afford. One of the richest countries in one of the richest moments in history, we can still afford to make sure they live a decent life and that their kids get an excellent education regardless. We can afford to do these things. These are choices that we are deliberately making not to do them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what I'd like to see in 5 years' time.
Yep. Nice. I think I'd vote for that.
Good.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we can do it. I don't even think it's that hard. We just have to get the people who want it not to happen out of the way.
The
literally.
roadblocks.
The roadblocks. Sorry, you're old. What was Bob Dylan's song that everyone sang when I was young? Your old ways are rapidly changing. Get out of the way. If you can't, lend a hand. The times, they are a change.
They are. They definitely are.
Now, that's an old school boomer reference, if ever you've heard it.
Still relevant.
Well, everything old is new again. And in fact, in 200 years' time, if we're lucky enough to survive that long, people will look back and they will confuse the 1930s with the 2020s.
Yeah.
We see it sharply demarcated. But if you think back to the 1850s or the 1750s, bloody hard to know which one was which.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you mentioned scarcity before, and like I recently took Saul Griffith for a drive. He's just
I've met Saul,
You've met Saul, yeah.
Yeah.
And
I did a little bit of work for him, actually.
Oh yeah. And yeah, his new book, The Big Switch, talks about how, you know, in one aspect we could have abundance of energy. And I'm going to give one more. We're almost done, but I'm going to give one more Norwegian example.
Okay.
We've had a few today.
Yeah. Oh, look, I'm a fan of the Scandinavian countries too.
Yeah. So
they're a model that we refuse to look at.
Yeah.
Interestingly.
Yeah, absolutely. So on Twitter a few months ago, a guy from Norway tweeted a screenshot of the spot price of electricity in the Norwegian grid. Did I tell you about this one?
No, I don't think so.
So there was an abundance of wind energy coming off the North Sea from all the massive offshore wind farms.
Yep.
And it dropped the spot price of electricity in Norway down to 0.1 cents per kilowatt hour, right? And this Norwegian guy posted a screenshot of it, and he said, I just fully charged my Tesla Model 3 for 10 cents.
Oh, wow. Dream on, Australia.
Yeah.
Look at what you're paying per litre at the moment, and it's going to get worse with what's going on.
What is it now, $2 or something?
Something like that, yeah. I think my husband was thrilled when he got $1.79 the other day.
My parents run a petrol station in central Queensland, and they've run it for 38 years, and my mum said last Friday was the biggest single day wholesale price increase in 38 years.
That's amazing. I know. Well, it's and that itself is also going to work, because what that is going to force people to do is think, well, I'm going to get a bloody electric vehicle. I don't want to, spend all this money on bloody petrol and have to be in queues, and we'll end up with odd days. Your odd number can go on these days and your even number can go on those days. Nobody wants to do that crap.
Yeah.
And if you've got an EV, you'll be laughing all the way past the queue.
Yeah, absolutely. And electric vehicle demand has gone through the roof, even just in the last couple of weeks.
I'm in the market for one. I've just got to find out how much it costs to put charging paraphernalia up at the farm, because there's not going to be a charging station here enough for some time, I'd say.
Yeah, well, once you get your solar panels and your Starlink and your charging station, you'll be totally fine up there. Look at the size of these potholes.
Yeah, I know. A woman.
Jeez.
I see. I could never take this car to the farm. We've got potholes entire families could live in on our dirt.
You might have to check out the Cybertruck. Yeah. I'll tell you about that another time.
My husband would be interested in that.
Yeah.
He wants an EV SUV.
Oh, yeah.
And there is one, there's a Ford, I think, in America that's he's interested in looking at. Because you can sort of feel it's coming, and you can sort of feel there'll come a point where suddenly you've got a petrol car and, you know, you're right out of the loop. And we have to change also the thing that I was dreading at the last election when he was going, it's to the end of the weekend. I mean, for goodness sake, what rubbish. But also I was thinking, we'll end up being the dumping ground for all the old, out-of-date, crappy petrol and diesel cars that they can't sell anywhere else.
It's already happening. It's already happening because we don't have vehicle emission standards in Australia.
We need those.
Yeah. Europe has them, so the legacy auto is really struggling to make electric vehicles, mind you, but those that are, they're diverting all of their production to Europe because of the vehicle emission standards there. They're mandated so to get their fleet emissions down.
That's why Volkswagen got into all that trouble, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, the Toyota are doing quite a lot of EVs now.
They're not actually.
They've got the Camry, is it, or the Corolla? One of them.
Yeah, they're still very low production.
Right, and there's the Leaf, the Nissan Leaf also.
Yeah. Tesla's really the only one that's cracked the big time with mass, like million cars per year.
We just need them to drop the price slightly.
Yeah, it'll come.
What about second-hand ones?
So, second-hand Tesla at the moment, Model 3, is about $10,000 more expensive than new.
Oh.
So they're appreciating asset at the moment.
Oh, that's no help.
Because the problem the thing that's the limiting factor on electric vehicles at the moment is increasing production.
Yes,
it's very difficult.
I get it. You've got to go from that point where you're still a bit of a novelty and an experiment to the point where you can actually do mass manufacture. And you've got to have the people to buy it before you can get there.
Yeah, but
you've got to get there before you've got the people to buy it.
The demand is there, right? Yeah. The demand is there. Tesla is growing at last year grew 87%. They're the fastest growing car company in history. Their whole effort at the moment is scaling production to meet demand, right? The demand's blown out to a year delay in the US and 7 months in Australia. And like, say for an iPhone.
So they're racing to catch up. It's like when I worked in advertising and you'd launch a product and it'd be so successful that it's sold out.
Yeah.
And there are all these people who wanted it, but you couldn't provide
That's
it.
what's happening now with Tesla. And it's been happening for a couple of
stock.
years. It's been happening for a couple of years. And so like, for an iPhone or for a small product, it's relatively easy to scale production. But for large automotive, it's like people don't understand that the effort and the engineering challenge to scale production.
Yep. Mind you, we must have gone through this problem before. And wasn't it Henry Ford who solved it?
Yeah,
they can have any colour they want as long as it's black.
Yeah. That's kind of what Tesla's replicating. Yeah. I just look at all these cars now as just complete junk. Even this Porsche ahead of us.
Oh, they are junk. Yes, it's technology's tipping point. It's like the beta video cassette.
Yeah.
But not just the beta, all video cassettes and vinyl records. Though they're now a collector's item. So now, just tell me, no handbrake. How do you turn the car off?
So you basically push, there's a button on the end of the paddle.
Yep, got that.
Push that. That's it, it's off.
And the handbrake, it's got its own internal kind of ability.
Yep, that's like the handbrake in one. And then when we get out, it's basically turned off. Now, I'm just going to give us a quick wrap up.
Yep.
Jane Caro, thank you so much for coming for a drive with us today.
Oh, thank you for asking me. It's been awesome.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I've learnt a lot, and I just want to wish you all the best for the campaign leading up to the election.
Yes, vote one Jane Caro in the Senate. If you're in New South Wales, we'll be Reason Australia above the line. And I would really like to push all this stuff further forward and see some of it come to fruition.
Yeah.
And I think we have to get good-minded, good-hearted, progressive people in Parliament to see that happen.
Yeah, fantastic. And maybe we'll see you in Canberra in a few months.
Wouldn't that be exciting? I'd love that.
Thanks,
but
Jane.
we'll wait and see. Thank you.